Good to see you.
What's
Good to see
up,
you.
brother? How you
Always a
doing?
big pleasure. I'm doing really well. It's just hot as fuck lately here in Mexico, man. We're hanging on. We're hanging on. How are you
Nice.
doing?
And you're still rocking the
I'm
beanie.
still
That's commitment.
rocking the beanie.
Yeah.
I'm committed to the beanies, man. I am what you would say a beanie enthusiast.
I love it.
I think if there's a hat that should be promoted, it's the beanies.
They don't get enough love. I would agree
They
with
don't get
that.
enough love
So,
because you
no,
look kind of hippie, on the hippie side, I'm guessing the hippie friends don't get much love.
no, they always need more love because they're not big on self-promotion. So you got to help them out.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
that's for real, man. Those are some wise words. How are you doing? How are you feeling?
I'm doing well. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling better now that we're doing this. And saw some of those recent physique pics, man. You're looking solid.
Oh shit, man. It's a big honor. It's a big pleasure. And actually, man, talking about the king of segues, I'm planning. I hope everything goes well and according to plan. I'm actually planning on competing in October as a natural athlete. So I'm doing all the best I can to learn to pose decently, to rock some decent poses.
Let's
Because man,
go.
I didn't have an idea about all that situation prior.
Hey, man, you're starting at the right time. A lot of people don't invest a sufficient amount of effort into posing, and unfortunately, it shows on stage. So you're gonna look like a pro. 'Cause I know you're a dedicated man to his craft. So I'm excited to see it, dude. October, it's exciting.
That is the dream, man, to be a natural pro bodybuilder such as yourself.
Stop that.
So, contest prep, fat loss, eating disorders, low energy
Mm.
availability, relative energy deficiency in sport. There's a lot to talk about. But I wanted to start at the beginning in a philosophical paper, I would say, that you published alongside, let me get the name right, Adrian Kind,
Hmm.
because I think that's the first step that we need to look in regards to bodybuilding. Is it actually a sport? What is the counter argument of not being a sport? And on top of that, building on top of that, we can dig into the is it healthy side of things. So, as clear as that, is bodybuilding a sport?
I don't know. Um, what I will say though is that attempts to classify it in published philosophy papers as not a sport, I think, have thus far been insufficient. Because when you attempt to say that bodybuilding is not a sport and you want to actually do that with some kind of logical rationale, it ends up excluding other things that we currently consider a sport as not a sport. Um, and for a philosophy paper to get published, which is a new area to me. I'm a sports scientist by trade, but Dr. Adrian Kind, actually very soon to be a doctor. I think he's defending his PhD like almost either this week or next week, so very soon. But anyway, um, the way that you have to make an argument in published philosophy papers is having a logical construct that is able to be defended and that it holds true in all cases, right? And that's why I think it was a really good experience to be a part of that paper because it makes you think in terms of the philosophy of science instead of just like doing studies like I do. And I think that's sometimes missing. And a lot of misinterpretations and biased statements could be avoided if we all thought a little more logically. So anyway, um, we wrote a response to a article that was claiming that based upon certain criteria, bodybuilding should not be considered a sport. And the principal argument was that um, it doesn't meet four certain criteria that all sports should meet. And then the kind of second or parallel argument was that there is a spectrum from more artistic performances to more sport-like athletic performances, and that bodybuilding sits too far close to the artistic performance. Um, I think the problem with that second argument is pretty obvious. You're starting with an assumption that something can't both be art and sport. And I don't think there's any reason that we would necessarily buy that. There's no solid argument there. In fact, we have sports called artistic gymnastics and rhythmic gymnastics. We have breakdancing competitions, which are incredibly athletic, but also very performative. And it's difficult to argue which one of those are sports or not sports. So, yeah, if we want to dig into that really far, it's a challenge. I think there are certain necessary conditions for sports related to them having a ranking aspect, having some type of physical exertion on the day, being influenced by having more skill in that physical exertion, and then also it being active rather than passive. At least if we're talking about physical sports, not say esports or chess or something like that. And we made what I think is a pretty solid case that bodybuilding does actually reach all of those criteria, even though the original author that we were arguing against that it does not. However, to be perfectly honest, I think someone probably could construct some other logical argument to where bodybuilding would not be a sport without excluding a bunch of other sports like gymnastics, for example. I don't know what that would be. I haven't thought about it enough. But I can understand why people might see bodybuilding as maybe more pageant-like than actually sport-like. But I think that debate is yet to be settled and may not be settled in the near future.
Yeah, because when you talk about philosophy, you can make arguments on both sides and can be convincing. And specifically on the language that you use can be quite convincing in the philosophy side of things, which reminds me that was actually my first choice of a professional career path. So I'm glad I
Mm.
didn't I didn't go that route because yeah, I would wear like three beanies on top of this because it's even hippier.
You wouldn't be able to afford three beanies if you did a philosophy degree, let's be
Shot,
honest. So
yeah, shots fired, and yeah,
two
yeah,
beanies tops. Yeah.
two beanies stops for life, two beanies for life.
Hmm.
But I think it's important to actually recognize bodybuilding as a athletic effort
Hmm.
because it is in both the training and also the contest itself, the posing, because I'm experiencing just right now how difficult it is. And I know it has an artistic component. But for me, at least, the whole artistic component, it's been a whole new revelation upon my life in the bodybuilding experience because I didn't experience it before, before learning to pose, to rock a little bit of this, facial expressions that they used to do. It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. And speaking of that, now that we talk about a little bit about if it's a sport or not, what are actually the physiological demands when a person tries to lose sufficient body fat to look competitive on a bodybuilding stage? Because for me at least, just to let you speak, I think the problems come with anxiety and let's say anxiety decision making. Let's say you don't have a plan really. Maybe you're in a rush to get lean, and if you're in a rush to weight a certain weight, maybe you tend to research to diuretics, the laxatives, whatever, and that's the unhealthy side of things. Because if you look at the history of bodybuilding, people before bodybuilding existed as itself, I don't know, you would call them unhealthy. People lean, not competitive lean, but lean, strong, promoting a healthy lifestyle. Where is the dissociation, Where is the disconnection between those early stages of bodybuilding and what we now say it's inherently unhealthy? I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but to me
No,
that's
very well.
kind of the confusion.
Yeah, and I also don't know that this is unique to bodybuilding. I think so. For example, just to give you a parallel, the anxiety of not being lean enough for the right weight, or do I need to diet faster, or things like that. Let's take a parallel performance individual sport, like the 100-meter sprint. As you're preparing for this big competition, let's say Olympic trials or national championships or something like that, you're training and you're going to have a good idea of what your 100-meter sprint time is in a recovered state during certain phases of your training. And you also are going to know what it's going to require to, let's say, qualify for the Olympics or be at your best or win nationals or place on the podium or get a medal, just depending upon whatever your level is. And there's going to be anxiety and decision making stress based upon whether you're reaching that outcome as well. And there are parallels in powerlifting, and it's not uncommon to see someone make an error in terms of their nutrition or their training in either one of these sports because they are maybe anxious that they aren't where they should be. It's very common for sprinters to diet because any mass that you have to move down the track. So they try to stay really, really lean. And they also have to train quite hard to be that fast. And powerlifting is a weight class based sport. And you also have an objective and a constant idea of where your performance is based upon your estimated 1RMs. And it's not uncommon there for athletes to overtrain, diet at inappropriate times when their volume and their intensity is coming up, et cetera, et cetera. So the piece that connects all of those is that you've taken something that is historically an activity of physical culture, which I'll talk about in a second, and health and human performance. And when you bring the competitive aspect to it, and then you make it into a competition and you put rewards and incentives in place there, then it becomes almost inherently unhealthy. I think high performance is always going to have, competitive high performance sport is always going to have elements of at least potential conflict between health and performance. And that is the nature of competition. So historically, we started with philosophy. We said, hey, is this art or sport? Probably both. And extreme art is not always healthy either. You know, we can think of some of the interesting ways that our artists have expressed themselves, sometimes at the expense of their own health, right? So it's not even a unique thing to sport in that case. But okay, but if we take bodybuilding is at least competitive, even if we can't necessarily say it's a sport, then we know it has that same potential as other sports. Then we go back to when was bodybuilding almost exclusively healthy? And this is probably an era where it wasn't called bodybuilding, it was called physical culture. Most known in the West as a kind of vaudeville era, 1800s to early 1900s phase of where we had the interest in physical fitness that included lifting, right? And the godfather of modern bodybuilding, Eugen Sandow, as the name that he took as his stage name, was one of the first kind of vaudeville style, circus act style strongmen who was displaying his physique as part of his shows. Wasn't the only one, but he was easily the most prominent and the best at marketing himself. And while it also wasn't the very first bodybuilding competition, it was the largest. There was the Great Competition of 1901, which was held in London, known as the Great Competition, which Eugen Sandow hosted, which was done in the UK after a bunch of qualifiers in a few years prior. And it actually had 3 judges and a bunch of guys trying to compete to be the best male physique in Ireland and the UK at the time. And shortly after that, you had Bernard McFadden kind of being the Eugen Sandow of the US. And he had seen Eugen at the World's Fair. And in the early 1900s, you've got him starting these competitions. And most of them were done, and the qualifiers were done through these mail-in photos to strength and health magazines in both the UK and the US. And you can just tell from that title there, it is a bodybuilding competition. People are looking at their physiques and comparing them, but the magazine is strength and health. So in the early days when physical culture had not yet become competitive bodybuilding, aesthetics, strength, and health were all seen as the same thing. Form follows function, and they were seen as a reflection of one another. So anything that would degrade your health was seen as a negative for aesthetics and a negative for performance. So it was rare that people would at least intentionally do things that would harm their health. If you looked at some of the things that Bernard McFadden promoted, like strict vegan diets and some other quackery and things like that, not that there's anything wrong with being vegan, but at the time, how it was promoted and for the reasons for it and the way it was done and fasting and things like that, it was pretty out there. So anyway, once we started to see the organization of bodybuilding become a pretty and more consistent competitive endeavor, it got progressively more challenging for there not to be conflicts of health and performance, right? So in the early days, after Bernard McFadden, after Eugen Sandow, we had the kind of the AAU era. That's the American Athletic Union, where we had these Olympic lifting competitions, which is also burgeoning at this time. It was only in I think the 1920s when it became its own sport, not part of athletics or track and field, not an event for that. So in this early era, for example, the Mr. America competition, which was hosted by the AAU, was done the day after senior weightlifting nationals. And to compete in the Mr. America, you had to compete in senior weightlifting nationals. So that means that you had to actually be a good enough weightlifter to qualify for nationals to even do the competition,
Sure.
right? So this is the era of Bob Hoffman and York Barbell, who was basically the only reason why the U.S. was competitive in the early days of American weightlifting, because he had a manufacturing plant that he basically subsidized all of Olympic weightlifting for through the early half of the 1900s. And then someone you might have heard of, or two brothers you might have heard of from Canada, Joe and Ben Weider, came around in the 50s and 60s, and they started saying, hey, we don't think that bodybuilders should always be second fiddle to strength. And we think there's a different way to train for those who want just to purely develop their musculature. And that's when, at the same time, we started to see the development of the first weightlifting machines that got commercialized at a large level. And the 1960s is really where anabolic steroids hit the bodybuilding scene pretty pervasively. And so we see this point now where strength, health, and hypertrophy training are all starting to diverge. It's been 50 years of people actually competing in bodybuilding. And now there's the ability to specifically isolate muscle groups and focus just on hypertrophy training, a social will to do so, and judging standards that are now removing the athletic elements and the health elements. There is, of course, still the Mr. America where they interview you, ask you questions, and you get points for character and athletic points. But there's all these new rash of IFBB competitions where it's purely based upon what do you look like. And athletes are also now getting access to things like Dianabol and Nilevar, the first over-the-counter oral steroids, when previously it was really very sparse and inaccessible at the time. So at this point, it's becoming more and more and more competitive. Now, the interesting thing about it becoming more and more and more competitive is that the standards are going up. So as we saw basically if you look at all the Mr. Olympia winners from the very first, Larry Scott, all the way up to our current Mr. Olympia winners, we see this kind of increase in body weight, right? And if you look at, there's a great book by John Fair, which catalogs the history of the Mr. America competition. And he also, at the end, shows the ages that Mr. America winners died. And for the first, 30 years of the Mr. America competition, it's all 70s and 80s, right? And then it starts to get into the 50s and the 60s, and occasionally a few guys dying in their 40s as we get into the anabolic steroid era. So you can see the competitive drive and the lack of drug testing in bodybuilding, at least mainstream, typical enhanced bodybuilding, is pushing the boundaries of the conflict between health and performance, right? So this is all going on, and you're also seeing the leanness standard getting higher and higher and higher. So looking more and more and more like an anatomy chart, and a superhero who is shredded is driving all of these kind of conflicts between health and performance. And that's something you see parallels in every sport. It's just that bodybuilding, you don't get to leave it at the practice field. You have to take it with you every time you eat. And you don't get to choose to eat or not. You can choose to train or not. But if you want to get on stage and be competitive in bodybuilding, even natural bodybuilding, the elements that you brought up before of low energy availability, dieting, and being focused, anxiety, all those things, some are unique to bodybuilding, like the dieting aspect, at least to the extremes that bodybuilding demands. But most of it is not unique, and it's just expressed differently through the sport of bodybuilding than other sports. So that's kind of the history. So I think the point at which people started competing in bodybuilding was the point where you couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. And then the point when we really saw kind of this exponential increase in the conflict between performance and health is the time point in which bodybuilding got divorced from health and strength through that competitive drive, and then also at the same time as the advent of anabolic steroids. And in the modern era, now each individual competitive bodybuilder just has to decide where do they want to personally draw that line in the sand. And maybe not even competitive bodybuilder, but just serious bodybuilder. Do I want to not actually compete so that I don't have to get unsustainably lean? Am I okay with competing, but I don't want to partake in anabolics? Am I okay with competing and I do want to partake in anabolics, but only to a limit, knowing that that might be a barrier for me to being as competitive as possible, and I'm okay with that. Or I'm going to take this as far as I can and put all the same effort in that someone who does win the Olympia puts in, knowing that we saw those body weights just climb up, climb up, climb up, climb up, and peak like right around Ronnie Coleman, and not come down from there.
Okay.
Knowing that at least in the open division, um, we gotta you have to be willing to do anything really when it comes to it, and you can tell that not everyone draws a line in the same place because natural bodybuilding is huge. While it's far more diversified in terms of the number of federations, the actual number of competitors is probably greater than that of the enhanced competitors, and it's hugely marketable because the NPC and IFBB are now actually trying to crack into the natural scene, for those who are paying attention to some of the politics. And also look at the advent of men's physique, bikini, wellness, figure, and of course the most popular one right now, which is a throwback to a less extreme era, classic bodybuilding for men with the popularity of Chris Bumstead. So there are many people who are just simply not necessarily wanting to look the way that the extremes of competition have driven the open bodybuilders to look, or they're not willing or don't want to make some of those health sacrifices, and they want to be on a lower dose, or they want to be on nothing at all because their health is to some degree differently important than their competitive desires based upon how risk averse they are, how competitive a person they are, what their values are, what else they have in life, the legality status of anabolics in their country, their history, all kinds of things.
That, that's a lot to unpack. And I have a stupid thing to say first before I forget it. Extreme art. I know you're a hip hop head. You made me think of the 90s beefs between the East and the West. I think it got quite to the extreme that people got shot. So talk about it. Extreme art there. I don't think getting shot is quite healthy or for your health overall. So that's the first thing I thought with extreme art. And then
Absolutely.
moving on to the more serious part of things, I think it's actually, or at least from my point of view, which is obviously biased towards the natural side of things, is the natural bodybuilders that are pushing the limits of what is considered lean, what is leanness, extreme leanness, because you see a lot of crazy stuff, man, with people from the United Kingdom, from Spain. You see striated glutes as a norm, not as something, oh, he's the one that has striated glutes, they'll do, and it's quite crazy. And I think we're living in a really interesting, let's say, bodybuilding age as far as natural things go. Because with all the knowledge, in my own particular case, with all the conversations that I've had along the years, with people such as yourself that have been terribly enlightening, man, it's quite the opportunity for me. I think when I get to understand from a physiological side of things what is needed for me to get sufficiently lean, okay, I can take the bullet, but I don't push it. I'm not anxious towards making crazy decisions or using diuretics or getting on extreme diets, because I know the process, it's slow. It's better to be slow, to just pay attention, let's say, to rate of weight loss, pay attention to your training performance, and keeping it as simple as that. For me, at least, it's been a game changer. Like, I cannot tell you, man. It's really been so chilled, the process, because I don't get stressed if my performance goes a little bit down some session, 2 sessions, because I know that also happened in the off season. So why should I stress about that? Let's just pay attention to the averages, and that on top of how I'm looking, how I'm feeling, how is my objective measures, such as and such my subjective measures, hunger and whatever, stress. Pairing that with training performance gets things to be so elegantly simple for me. I don't want to ramble on, but for me, getting that physiological knowledge from yourself, from mass research review, from just the research side of things in general, I think that's where I get to acknowledge that bodybuilding can actually be healthy. I'm obviously biased, so I gotta admit that. Because I used to think that it's just inherently unhealthy to get lean,
Mm.
some people still operate on that idea that if you have abs or veins in your abs, oh, that's unhealthy. Well, really, is it? I know that for some people to get there, they might need to go into a little bit of a low energy availability, maybe season, a couple of weeks. But it's not the whole month, that took you to get there. So why would it be inherently unhealthy?
I think it's a great question. And ultimately, the more we start to define our question, the easier it is to answer this, because like you said, there's a lot to unpack. And if we go, all right, if we're talking about drug-free competitive bodybuilding, um, can it be on average for most people a healthy pursuit? I think the answer is a clear yes, actually. Um, so for those who aren't familiar, relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S, is something that came around. You'll see it popping up in the research as an evolution from the female athlete triad. And it's the idea that there are these hypothalamic mediated responses to not consuming enough food for what you need to fulfill your physiological processes while being very active, and that results in downregulation of various body systems to accommodate for that energy shortfall, which can have negative experiential performance and health related effects that are, importantly, largely temporary, at least in adults, most of the time, depending upon how severe it is and how long it lasts. And if you look at the 2023 updated statement, one of the things they had to acknowledge was that there is both functional and non-functional low energy availability. And if we think about it, if low energy availability leading to RED-S was just like a death sentence for health, we would not be having this conversation today. The
Yeah.
evolutionary history of humanity is one that we have had to operate in states of low energy availability and famine. And not only operate, but run around nearly buck naked in the cold with spears while we're trying to kill each other, be killed by animals, kill those animals to eat them, and make it through periods of extreme famine and fasting. So we can see in the examples of the remaining hunter-gatherer populations on the planet now that you can have functional low energy availability. Now, there might be consequences like shorter stature, lower testosterone counts, lower birth weights, higher infant mortality, all these things that the modern era has sort of fixed for the most part, at least in developed nations, are still present. But they're not things that are, in all cases, complete barriers to sufficient health. So again, it's kind of, where do you draw the line? In bodybuilding, there are certain things that are required, and there are certain things that come along with it. And it's ultimately a question of how temporary are the effects and how much can you mitigate the potential things that you don't need to do, but that are quite common. You talked about shifting your mentality and your perspective around what you have to do. And that's a really critical key element for any person who wants to have a sustainable career in physique sport, is reducing their anxiety, not having arbitrary food restriction rules, not having motivations that are relevant or related to hating themselves, or having a negative body image. Understanding that it's quite possible to want to modify your body without disliking it to start. Being, hey, it would be really cool to be muscular, does not mean I hate myself when I'm not muscular or I think I'm less than. It's an art project. It's akin to saying, I would like to get a tattoo, right? It's not saying when I don't have a tattoo, I'm ugly, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think there are a lot of people in competitive bodybuilding who come from a background of having eating disorders and having body dysmorphia or having just body image concerns in general. And if that still remains while they compete, it can be quite challenging to have positive reasons and a positive experience. But for some, they might have that background and it has evolved to the point where they're quite happy in their bodies in normal settings, even if they're not muscular, even if they're not lean. And they know that getting lean and being muscular is not something that relates to their self-worth, but their success as a bodybuilder or their competitive success. They may like it, they may appreciate it, but they don't make it about their self-worth or the entirety of their identity. And I think those are critical things. So how you see yourself is one thing. The overlap between your body self-worth, perception of beauty outside of the sport and your competitive success, I think it's important to have divisions between those. Um, and then, like you said, the actual approach you take, and this is where evidence-based practice comes in. You can get shredded by doing a crash diet on a low micronutrient quality approach with an extreme amount of cardio. Um, or you can get shredded by taking your time, potentially using intermittent dieting strategies to break up periods of low energy availability, auto-regulating elements of it so that when you do experience pretty bad symptoms of sleep deprivation or emotional stress, you can do a diet break. You can incorporate elements of mindfulness. You can have a sports psychologist and a dietitian and a physiotherapist in your corner so that when things crop up, you can mitigate those issues. And then you can get shredded and get on stage with the minimum amount of these low energy availability symptoms. But some things are unavoidable. You can't evidence-based your way into being shredded all the time and feeling great and having no negative effects, because there's more than just the diet that goes on. So when you decide to compete in bodybuilding, you're definitely going to experience almost a 99 out of 100 cases, unless you're just really naturally lean, getting below what's called your lower intervention point, which is simply being leaner than your body would otherwise want to be, because it's a potential threat to your survival. And that is also going to be similar effects to low energy availability, hypothalamus mediated downregulation of things. Why is that? Because adipose tissue is not just this inert stuff that is annoying because it gets in the way of our muscle. It's actually an organ, and it secretes leptin. And leptin is one of the signals that is received by the hypothalamus that tells us of our overall energy status. So we can be eating enough, but be really shredded and still have pseudo effects of low energy availability. And those can stack on top of each other, which is why dieting feels progressively harder. Being in a deficit when you're shredded feels a lot worse than being in a deficit when you're much higher in body fat. And we have physiological empirical data showing that. Obese men, they start dieting, their testosterone health markers improve.
Yeah.
Lean men, they start dieting, testosterone actually goes down. So it's the exact opposite signal. You layer on top of that some of Herman Pontzer's data and the data we have around exercise energy compensation and the constrained model of energy expenditure, and we can see that if we're doing too much activity or too much cardio, that we can exacerbate the downregulation in energy expenditure, right? We see drops in NEPA, we see drops in NEAT. And then if we're just training too hard overall and trying to sustain a very high output in both cardio and resistance training, we can get effects of overreaching and even potentially overtraining, when we're doing all this at the same time. So it's unclear, am I experiencing overtraining syndrome? Am I experiencing exercise energy compensation? Am I experiencing being below my lower intervention point? Am I experiencing relative energy deficiency in sport? Am I experiencing metabolic adaptation? And the answer, if you do it really aggressively and kind of wrong and take it the most hardcore approach as possible, the answer is yes, all of the above, D. But if you were to take your time, do only the necessary amount of cardio possible, come in and out of energy deficits, have a small energy gap, make sure that your diet is well balanced, and do all the things I talked about, you only have to do the things that are required, which is a temporary period of low energy availability and probably being below your lower intervention point. And that is, like I said, potentially a functional low energy availability state and being leaner than your body would like, which is a transient negative effect. When we look at case studies on bodybuilders, in most cases, especially among those who don't beat around the bush with restoring a positive energy balance state, regaining weight, and getting out of a state of low energy availability, we typically see a complete restoration of all of those negative markers. And it's not a purely negative thing that happens either. Some of the work that's actually come out of Finland, if you look at Juha Hulmi's group, Ahtiainen, and which I've had the pleasure of collaborating with, they've had these large data sets on people going in and out of contest prep and looking at various health markers. Believe it or not, even though there are some of these negative things that are happening, also Villa Sola, he's done his PhD in this topic, some of the cardiovascular health markers actually keep improving all the way into contest prep, even though some of, like, say, the metabolic markers or the hormone markers are getting worse, So, yeah, if you basically make it so there's almost never, high instances of blood triglycerides or blood glucose because you're always dieting and shredded, you're going to see these transient increases in a bunch of things that are beyond what is necessary for health. But yeah, certain markers are going to look pretty incredible in prep from a health perspective. Others are going to look pretty disastrous. I don't get your testosterone checked when you're 6 weeks out. But your blood pressure, your heart rate, your blood cholesterol panels, probably your blood glucose, all those things are going to look real good when you're quite lean and dieting. So it's a mixed bag. On the psychological front, we also see a mixed bag. People typically report higher anxiety, lethargy, negative affect, but people who successfully do go through competition and people who come back to it will report increased senses of self-efficacy and the ability to express themselves and building resilience and grit. The only problem with some of this data is that there could be some survivorship bias. So I think that's always worth acknowledging, as we're not seeing the people who didn't make it to stage and maybe how that could have been a quite negative experience. But again, just to go back to my earlier point, all the things outside of getting really, 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 really lean are more so shared with any sport that requires preparation and are not necessarily unique to bodybuilding. And most people who level the critique that bodybuilding is inherently unhealthy, you could make the same argument for most competitive sports at a high level.
Yeah, totally. And there is a paper, an interesting paper that you guys actually reviewed in mass that I wanted to cite. It's the one, Weight Loss Practices and Eating Behaviors Among Female Physique Athletes. It's by, let me get you the name, Alwan. Alwan. I don't know how to
Yep,
pronounce it, but Alwan
it's all one,
and their
yeah.
colleagues. The interesting thing, and the reason why I wanted to bring this particular paper up, is because, well, at least in the case of female competitors, as you know, what they found, the food restriction on 60% of those participants overall, 37% were considered at risk of developing an eating disorder, and 42% used two pathogenic weight loss controls, which I think it was laxatives and binge eating. I don't recall exactly, but the interesting point to me is that the coach itself, himself, herself, whatever, or another athlete, were the main influencers for these behaviors. So I think there is some of the unhealthy side of things in the way people talk about how to get
Yes.
lean, how do you need to train, and what is actually the path to leanness, rather on the physiological process on itself, acknowledging, like you said, that some parameters are gonna be better, some are gonna be, well, less better, let's say, but that's okay because it's not forever. It's just a couple of weeks, and then you do, or well, you're supposed to have a plan for afterwards. But the interesting side here, and what I wanted to discuss with you, is that maybe it's not the process, the physiological process on itself, but the things and the narrative that us as coaches and athletes do to get to the point,
100%. Here's another way I'll draw an analogy. If you were to go to a big city with the highest rate of poverty and homelessness, and state cities are inherently unhealthy for society because they create this disparity. And then you were to go to the city of a similar a similar population density and size, where there is the lowest incidence of poverty and homelessness, you might not say the same thing. So it's not the fact that it's a city. It's something else. Economic system, uh, climate, what is imported, what is exported, uh, you know, whatever. I'm not an economist to know that, but I am logical enough to go, okay, so it's not that piece. So if someone wants to say that at large, the way physique sport is practiced is largely unhealthy, or at least a lot of the athletes are unhealthy, I'll say sure. But if you said, does it have to be unhealthy? And if we, and sometimes then the answer is no. And then sometimes people will push back and say, well, no, people are doing what they have to do. But the funny thing is, especially in drug-free bodybuilding, is that you can only go counter to health so far before it actually starts harming performance, if not this season, long term. So you get burnout, people don't get on stage. So I fully agree with you. A lot of the things that are associated with unhealthiness in bodybuilding are unnecessary and actually, in many cases, counterproductive. This is less true in enhanced bodybuilding, but there are plenty of examples. There are like it's true that if you want to be Mr. Olympia or Miss Olympia in the most muscular divisions, there's a degree of polypharmacy that you have to engage in that is pretty unhealthy. But there's always degrees. If you do that and have a really terrible mentality, beliefs about foods, hate your body, have, an eating disorder and body image concerns, that's worse than if you don't have those things but are still doing all that polypharmacy, right? So if I could wave my evidence-based magic wand, which unfortunately through evidence-based practice, I realize there's no such thing as a magic wand, I could probably create a world where it was 10% rather than say 40% of competitors who are reporting these things, and it would have more to do with things we couldn't change. Genetic predisposition to anxiety, obsessive compulsive behavior, and things like that. So for example, anorexia nervosa, which is the deadliest of eating disorders, has a very large heritable genetic component. We can't change that with practice. And that, and many of the things that are present in people with anorexia do overlap with some of the things you can see in bodybuilders. And it is in our paper towards a healthy nutrition paradigm in physique sport that I was the first author on in 2019, where I talked about all this. I kind of talked about three big buckets that led to why bodybuilding can be unhealthy, and some are modifiable, some are not. And one is just the predisposition towards some of these behaviors and the psychological and personality characteristics of competitors. The second, which is also not modifiable, is the physiological state that you must be in to get on stage and be successful without sacrificing performance. And then the third one, which is the most modifiable, is the methods you take to get there, right? So how do you manage the anxiety that is going to be interacting with your personality? How do you manage the nutrition and the training that is required to get into the state of leanness that is required? And that is a pretty big component, because even though, going back to my example, that anorexia nervosa has a large heritable component, it also has a large environmental component. There are many people with the genetics to where they could develop anorexia, but they don't have a childhood traumatic experience or a really chaotic environment growing up where they need to exert control, where they feel the need to exert control as a young child. So I think that's something that we really do have to acknowledge, and that there is a substantial amount of just really shitty stuff going on in bodybuilding that's unnecessary, because it is a tradition-based sport that's, if you even consider it a sport, it's not typically well-funded, and because it's heavily inundated by performance-enhancing drugs, especially on the enhanced side, and because those are classed as illegal substances in many, many countries, the culture of bodybuilding, especially enhanced bodybuilding, is one that is typically neutral at best, if not downright against like typical health guidelines and the kind of medical establishment. So in modern medicine, the way that clinicians are supposed to act is what's called generally a harm reduction model, right? Meaning that if I'm a GP, if I'm your doctor, if I'm an MD, and you come to me and you say, hey, I use a lot of anabolic steroids, growth hormone, insulin, DNP, clenbuterol, T3, T4, and I'm trying to, win the Olympia, and I'm concerned about my heart health. I wouldn't say, why would you be doing those things? That's illegal. This is a risk to you. Shame on you, bad person. And all your, we wouldn't have to worry about your heart health if you just get off this shit, you dummy. I would say, okay, tell me more about that. All right. So how long do you plan on doing this? I'd ask a lot of questions. And if you said, listen, I'm really, really committed to my sport. I'm trying to win the Olympia. I'm aware of the effects, but I'm going to keep doing this. I go, okay, well, let's get your heart panel done, and let's discuss, what do you need to do? What conceptions do you have? How are you taking these drugs? What does your diet look like? What other things do you do? Do you drink? Do you use any recreational drugs? Where are there other opportunities for me to help you find the best health in the constraints of someone who's trying to chase the Mr. Olympia? But that
Yeah.
was not the model in the 90s, and there's some qualitative interviews with enhanced bodybuilders from the 90s where they express that their doctors were uninformed related to the kind of drugs they were taking, and then B, were largely judgmental, and they didn't feel they could be honest with them. And if you go even prior to that, it took maybe 20 years of athletes using performance enhancing drugs, specifically anabolic steroids, before the research actually showed that, yes, we do think they have performance enhancing effects. So the bodybuilding world basically thought scientists were idiots because they couldn't confirm what bodybuilders knew to be obviously true. And a big part of that was, unfortunately, the U.S. demonization in the 80s and 90s because of baseball. Because gotta love your American pie in baseball. And Congress, bringing Mark McGuire and Jose Canseco, and then basically making the world see anabolic steroids the same way they saw the rest of the drug war at the time with Reagan and the 80s and 90s, and it basically being something like, cocaine or meth. And the class 3 scheduling of anabolic steroids and the stigmatization of it also shut down a lot of any potential research we could have on these compounds. And we had some research come in the 90s, and then largely the amount of information we have about performance enhancing drugs is quite underdeveloped based on animal models. And, there's a lot of people who are taking drugs that are not, like for example, clenbuterol was stopped being used for a long time. Albuterol I think might be the one they use now, but it was generally seen as unsafe for heart health. But a lot of these drugs had a therapeutic use and got banned, or they're only used in veterinary settings, or they got abandoned by endocrinology as not being great, but they're still used. Or another thing to consider is, where do you think bodybuilders are getting their drugs? In some countries, yeah, you can just go to the pharmacy and you can get pharmaceutical grade stuff, or it's legal. But since they've been Schedule 3 drugs in the U.S. and made illegal in most countries, you have to go to the same guy who's willing to sell you like GHB and meth.
Yeah.
And, homie's like, yeah, of course this is the right dosage. And of course this was made in a great lab. There's many times where people who are taking anabolics are not even taking the compound they think they are and the doses they think they are, and it was made in conditions that would absolutely not be considered safe. And the drugs themselves haven't even been tested for safety in humans. So there's a lot that goes into why bodybuilding is unhealthy that don't necessarily need to be there in enhanced and natural bodybuilding. And to just kind of keep the conversation simpler, because of all of that, there's this general mistrust, and we see it today. There's a pushback against science, right? People are, they think they know better, and they do until science knows better, right? In the case of kind of the example I gave, but in modern sports science, we have a really good idea of what is the key issues that lead to some of the female athlete triad and now relative energy deficiency and sports syndromes. We see overtraining, overuse injuries, and athlete burnout. And those are all things that coaches and athletes can do. And indeed, doing them wrong not only makes it unhealthy, but actually worsens it, if not acute performance, long-term performance. So I think there is a tremendous amount of opportunity for us in the evidence-based community to make bodybuilding healthier in practice and get it closer to this ideal where there's only some transient potential negatives that are not all bad. Like I said, it's a mixed bag, and that after you get out of the contest prep phase can return to a very normal state. and that the net effect of participating in drug-free bodybuilding would be a positive on one's life if you do it right. Now, with that said, I do think you need to do screening. Not everyone is going to be able to participate in bodybuilding with a relatively low risk of harm. I think if you have a background of, say, binge eating disorder, if you have a very high lower intervention point, if you are someone with a predisposition towards anxiety, obsession, neuroticism, it may not be, the juice may not be worth the squeeze to at least compete in it. There are some women who are much more sensitive to low energy availability. Now, I could put on my evolutionary biology hat or my physical anthropology hat and say, and there's data to support this, that low energy availability is not something that women are as well adapted to. If we looked at hundreds of thousands of years of hunter-gatherers, typically you have the gatherers and the childbearers and the people raising the children as the women, and then you have the men running around, burning a ton of calories to hopefully get calories. And that means that the men who could survive and do that effectively, and the babies who could survive, are going to be more resilient to states of low energy availability. And indeed, when you look at that 2023 IOC statement about REDS, you see that men seem to tolerate lower energy intakes and lower energy availabilities better than women on average. I can tell you as a coach that there's a huge disparity there. You know, there are some women who can get all the way into stage condition and are still having the menstrual cycle. And there are some women who lose it within 6 weeks before you've even really pushed them that hard. And how leanness interacts with that is also a kind of a separate topic. There's one case study that I can think of, and I can't remember the first author, but it took a year and a half for a woman to regain her menstrual cycle. And she did gain weight. There was like basically a descriptor of someone who was kind of doing a reverse diet, but she did, after getting back up to the weight that she started her diet at, still did not have her menstrual cycle back. And I can't know for sure that it was all just related to the stress and the intermittent nature and maybe kind of binge restrict kind of behaviors, and the reverse diet approach probably had an influence. But for all I know, even if she'd done things right, it might have still been 6 months, 8 months of not having a menstrual cycle, which is not ideal, right? That's not a great thing. There are consequences to having long-term suppression of your sex hormones related to bone mineral density or general health. So I do think that there are some people, for either physiological or behavioral reasons that are probably physiologically mediated, that it's going to be very hard for them to have an overall positive experience from competitive bodybuilding. But I think we should broaden the umbrella of bodybuilding a little bit to where you can participate as a bodybuilder without necessarily getting on stage. You know, finding what's the most muscular physique you can walk around with without having some of these symptoms of low energy availability or stressing about food. You know, kind of having like a walk around beach lean, quote unquote, physique that's muscular, I think is something, you know, related to whatever your baseline is, I think is a very reasonable and healthy goal for everyone. And that's kind of basically going back to the physical culture era. Now, getting on stage to be competitive, the competitive technical guidelines as a judge, they don't care what your physiology is. They don't care what your genetics are. They say, hey, the most muscular person, the leanest person who has these proportions, at least in the bodybuilding division, or meets these criteria wins. Yeah. So if you get on stage with a bunch of other freaks, you're going to have to get pretty freaky. And it doesn't matter if you grow up with obesity, if you have a predisposition towards neuroticism, and you know, you're an extreme adapter as far as energy expenditure down regulation. It's just going to be really freaking hard. So
What resonates with me the most from this conversation is that the things that make bodybuilding apparently unhealthy are things that shouldn't be there in the first place, you know? That, yeah, we know that there are some trade-offs. There are non-negotiables like a deficit to get sufficiently lean, that you need to progressively overload your training, but not in the way that most people think of those particular things. You don't need to do more training every week. You don't need to do more training. You might, or you might be allowed if your own adaptation allows, but that doesn't mean you need to stress out about doing more sets, more reps, more of everything. you might be able to, and that should be an indicator of good training. And in the nutrition side of things, you don't need to cut calories because of guilt, because of you feeling fat or something like that, because you don't like the way you look. And those things that make bodybuilding, to me at least, unhealthy are, like we alluded, things that shouldn't even be there. So to me, the way that I understand and try to practice and preach and keep studying and perfecting the craft of bodybuilding in myself and the people that come to me trusting me with their process is that from the physiological side, like I alluded, there are non-negotiables. There's no other way around this. We need to get in a caloric deficit, but we are not going to be in a caloric deficit because you feel guilt, because you feel bad, because you need to prove something to anybody. We don't need to prove anything. Even though it's a competition, still then, I think we don't really need to prove anything. If you're willing to accept those terms and conditions, okay, we're ready to go. In training, you don't need to train 6, 7 days a week. Can you do 3 days a week and progressively overload those 3 days? Perfect. We're all set. And to me, those are the things in training and nutrition that I'm obviously biased because I love this thing called bodybuilding. These are the things that make for me bodybuilding healthy. And on the psychological side, which I think it's really fascinating, it builds resilience because you know you're gonna get hungry, but isn't hunger just a normal part of everyday life? Even when you're in a isocaloric, maybe even hypercaloric condition, you're just gonna get hungry. And what's wrong with being hungry? But I think to me the danger there, it's not saying or going with the narrative that more hunger, more deficit, you're a warrior, it's hunger, it's okay, it's just it is what it is. And being able to accept that not every week is gonna be linear, that your training is not always gonna be at least perfect in the way that we used to think about perfectly training, or there are some things that in the science side we are still discovering. We're not quite 100% sure, but maybe this would lead the way. I'm referring to things like training volume, partials, things like that. And accepting those terms and conditions and building that psychological flexibility and resilience, to me, that those things make bodybuilding one of for me, and again, I like to acknowledge that as much as possible because I'm so biased, make bodybuilding practice really an opportunity to be an overall better human being, man.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was like, oh, I wanted to look up some research because a lot of this is all about acknowledging what you do and don't have control over it, and accepting the things you don't have control over, and focusing on the things you do have control over, right? And and honestly, that's the secret to being happy in life. So that's why I think
Yeah, sure.
bodybuilding is quite a nice microcosm of looking at that, and I think some things it's more challenging to have agency over. Like if you're in a really, for lack of a better word, toxic kind of environment for bodybuilding, if everyone around you is very old school in a negative way and uses these unhealthy approaches and has a really unhealthy mindset, yeah, you can modify your environment, but you may not know where to go, right? It's very challenging for the average person who was, born in a poor, dysfunctional, alcoholic, violent, single parent home where there's a lot of gang activity to not go down a bad path. And you can't just be like, well, why didn't you choose to not join the gang? Why didn't you join choir? It's like, well, that's not the way that works. And it's easy to look at the choices that people made who did better and to then just blame the other people for not making those choices. But ultimately, what you have to look at is how do I change the environment around me to make it easier to do things better? And that's kind of like the whole reason 3D Muscle Journey exists. It's to have a narrative and a voice out there in a community to where we're focused not on just placing or this perfectionism, but in the outcome, but focusing on the journey and focusing on these positive aspects of having desire, dedication, discipline, and also having that sit within the realm of drug-free sport, right? And then that also being married with evidence-based practice, which is kind of my role in 3DMJ, we're focusing on all the potentially modifiable elements to try to get people a higher probability of having an experience like you and I are having, which is largely positive, you know. But this is, again, I think it's just, it's not specific to bodybuilding in many cases. And I think that's something that I want to keep bringing back, is that a lot of the critiques against bodybuilding, you have to level them at all sport. And that is something that I think a lot of people don't want to admit, because they have like you and I have a positive bias towards bodybuilding. There's a lot of people with a negative um, perspective. So there is a difference between um, perfectionism and striving for excellence, for example. Um, and like if you look at research in sports psychology, there are two different dimensions that they can quantify as far as perfectionism. So like this is just one example of how your perspective can shift as soon as you start to ask more detailed questions. So you can just get data on a quantitative score on a survey for an athlete on their perfectionism. And generally, perfectionism is negatively correlated with burnout, overtraining, happiness, and sustainability in a career. But once you start to look at two different dimensions of perfectionism, there's perfectionist striving and there's also perfectionist concerns. Both result in the action of trying to be perfect as an athlete. But perfectionist concerns are all related to the consequences of not being perfect and anxiety around not being perfect, fear of losing, fear of judgment, fear of losing things, right? It's all based upon, you know, if we wanted to be kind of colloquial, not living in a state of abundance. It's seeing things as a zero-sum game. Perfectionist striving, on the other hand, is not about where you are, it's about where you're trying to go. And it's about trying to achieve things. And we also see a parallel in successful goal achievement. When you have approach versus avoidance oriented goals, you typically see a greater outcome in people who set approach goals. And these are exactly what they sound like. An avoidance goal is like, oh, I'm going to stay away from sweets. An approach goal that might result in you more successfully staying away from sweets is, I'm going to try to eat fruits and vegetables and a lean protein at every meal. And you're going to find that that's going to displace the sweets. But as soon as you handcuff yourself and, you know, hate yourself when you try to eat sweets, it creates these negative cycles, right? So a lot of this is saying, I am who I am, and the world is what the world is, but I'm going to choose to participate and associate with certain parts of the world, and I'm going to set up my environment to the best ability I can to reward the parts of me and to give me opportunities to make the best decision I can. And then I'm going to make the best choices in those constraints that I can. So I think reframing and re-engineering your environment are essentially the biggest lessons that you can learn from bodybuilding. And that, if you look at all the successful bodybuilders, again, we're looking at survivorship bias, that's what they've done. And this is a useful way of framing survivorship bias as success leaves clues. Because there's a lot of people who will tell you, yeah, I used to do bodybuilding, but it was really unhealthy. Like I got an eating disorder, or like my coach made me take all these drugs, or suggest I take all these drugs, and it shut down my hormonal production. Or yeah, my coach, I wanted to compete in bikini, and my first competition, they had me on T3 DNP Anavar, and you know I had to go to the hospital because I was dehydrated and my voice changed, and now I don't even lift weights because it's terrible. I hate that world, you know, and they have this resentment. And like you said, it's understandable that those things occur, and if you don't know that there's any other way to do it, and every other person in the bodybuilding community around you says, yeah, that's just what happens, and then, you know, the people who are resilient survive, and if you didn't, it's because you're weak, that can be a really negative thing. But now that we have the internet, and that, you know, we're literally on other sides of the planet having a conversation, sharing information, you know, and you're bilingual, I'm not. We have these opportunities because of awesome people like you to share this information so we can reach beyond the constraints of our own environment and try to find better ways to do things, and hopefully uplift the whole sport, the whole community, so we have more opportunities to do this in the healthiest way possible and have the ability to get the positive effects and never get there because of the negative effects preventing us from even experiencing those potential positive outcomes.
Thanks for the flowers, man. And on a, when you put it there, Just to almost finish off, because as always, I want to be respectful of your time, man. And yeah, it is crazy that we are literally on the other side of the planet having a conversation, and people can join in, and then people can watch this whenever they want to and learn so much valuable stuff, that still blows my mind, and I think it will continue to do so. But the way I try to build and express myself with clients and with my own self in my bodybuilding journey, it's that acceptance, it's not quite the same as resignation,
Mm,
because acceptance is that or in my case, I accept that I need to lose body fat, I need to lose weight, but this is not coming from anxiety. This is not coming with dissatisfaction with the person that I am. This is not identity based. I don't need to lose weight to be me. And at the same time, I strive to be better, not because of anxiety again, not because there's anything to prove. And I think that's it's quite tricky to understand. I had the opportunity to be in therapy. I was like a year or something, and that's where I learned a lot of these things. And with all the papers that you review in mass on the psychological side of things, I learned a lot from those and how this all applied into whatever craft you want to do, but in this case, bodybuilding can lead to so much benefit in pretty much everybody that tries it. And I get it. I get it. I have that experience a lot of times that people that came from competing in bodybuilding and had terrible experiences, they think that that is bodybuilding.
mm,
They don't want to have anything else to do with bodybuilding. And for instance, when they see that I don't use any PEDs, that I consume salt, stuff that we assume it's normal, isn't it? But some people it's just not. That I don't do endless hours of cardio. It's like it opens up a new world that, oh, so you don't have to do all those things. And
yeah.
that's why I wanted to discuss specifically, is bodybuilding healthy? Because when people think bodybuilding is not healthy, they're thinking about certain practices. But when we think bodybuilding can be healthy, but it has some risk, okay, then the conversation switches, and there's so much to learn from there. So just to finish off with a little bit of, let's say, maybe personal question, but let's say in your worst bodybuilding years, anxiety, dissatisfaction, not the best information, what would be an advice that you would give to yourself with the knowledge and the practice that you gathered through the years, now being a professional natural bodybuilder and coaching hundreds of athletes, to that person in need of a really good advice?
Yeah. I think the advice I would have given to myself is um, think ahead, plan, ask questions, and be humble and get a coach. Because my very first season, I didn't have a coach, and that was the worst outcome. And I didn't plan ahead because I didn't know what would happen when the season was over, and I wasn't thinking about it. And a coach with some experience could have told me that. And if I was a little more humble, instead of just reading a bunch of things and thinking I was a smart science guy and just wanting to go at it alone, I think I could have had a plan at least for some of the things that I experienced and been under a lot less stress. Um, so yeah, I in many ways I'm glad I had that negative experience because it's what led to the formation of 3DMJ, so we could make it easier for people to have different experiences. But yeah, I think having patience too, um, and not forgetting the reason why I fell in love with the iron in the first place. Once I just started to be competitive, because I was supplanting my own initial reasons and love for the iron for competitive outcomes initially. And I've told this story many times, but I said something out loud that immediately concerned me to my wife back in 2007. I was like, if I didn't think I could become Mr. Natural Olympia, I don't know if I would keep lifting. And as soon as I said it, I was like, whoa, who I am is changing because I'm competing, and I'm not even necessarily fully aware of it or in control of it. So that type of mentality, just understanding that when you get hyper focused on something, and when you strive for something and you don't kind of keep hold of your initial values and your initial motivations, you can end up losing something in your pursuit of something else and not even realizing it until it's too late. So that would be my advice.
My man. This has been one of my most cherished conversations that we had over the years. And actually, we met, it was, I think, exactly a year ago in Mexico City. So this sort of kind
Oh,
of, yeah, it was a year ago, right? May 2023.
it was April.
So, it was April, right? It was close
Yeah.
to my birthday, actually. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I had my birthday while I was there. That's
yeah,
why I remember it was April. Yeah.
of course I remember, man. We had some 3D MJ cake, which was really good.
Good
And you were
times.
prepping. You were in the early stages of your prep, I remember.
It was early enough where I could still make cake work. Yeah.
Yeah, you can make cake work and also get a little bit a little bit of dance moves over there.
Well, the,
Still
the
the
dance
energy,
moves were
still.
necessary to burn off the cake.
Oh,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
there you go. And because bodybuilding is healthy, as you can see,
That's
no
right. That's
compensatory,
right.
no
Nope.
compensatory
Yeah,
behavior,
exactly.
not at all.
Yeah.
But man, thanks again for
My
taking the
pleasure.
time. This has been a really awesome conversation for myself. I hope at least a little bit of fresh stimulation for yourself
Oh,
because
100%. 100%. Always a joy.
thanks a lot, my man. So anyway, anytime you wanna have a conversation, I'm more than open to. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and I hope I can see you again in person sometime soon.
Right back at you, brother. Feel the same way. Thank you for this opportunity and the great convo.
Thanks to you, my man. Have a good day.
You too, buddy.
See you later.
Take care.